Hi everyone, and welcome to this webinar that's hosted by the Equal Media and Culture Centre in partnership with Pass the Mic and the University of Strathclyde. My name is Katie Go and I'm the project manager of the Equal Media and Culture Centre. This webinar is called Where Were the Women of Colour? Analysis of Scottish Media Coverage. Earlier this year, the EMCC, Pass the Mic and the University of Strathclyde partnered together to monitor the representation of women of colour in Scottish media during the 2024 general election. In this session, we're going to hear about the results of this research, as well as the work Pass the Mic has been doing for over 5 years to tackle the underrepresentation and misrepresentation of women of colour in Scotland's media. We're delighted that Talat Yaqoob of Pass the Mic is here to speak about this work. We'll hear from Talat first, and then from Professor Karen Boyle and researcher Melody House from the University of Strathclyde about the media monitoring that was done over the general election. Then we'll take a short 5-minute break, and then Talat will return to have a conversation with the journalist Assa Samaké-Roman to discuss the research findings, as well as Pass the Mic more generally. And finally, attendees will have the opportunity to ask questions to all of our panelists this evening near the end of our session. So you can get thinking about those questions and pop them into the Q&A box. So that is everything from me, and I'm going to pass the mic, if you will, over to Talat. And Talat, I'm controlling the slides, so just if you need me to move things, just give me a nudge.
Great. Thanks, Katie. Thanks so much. And hi, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here with you this evening, and thank you for joining us online. This is really an opportunity to talk about some data that we think in particular has been, I think the best way that we describe these things is disappointing but not surprising in the landscape of women of colour's representation or lack of representation, and indeed sometimes misrepresentation within Scottish media. If we go to the next slide, and I'll just give you a bit of an introduction as to where Pass the Mic came from. So Pass the Mic started in October 2019 as a list of 28 women of colour experts. It was quite literally just a WordPress single-page website that had a bunch of names and some descriptors of women that I have had the pleasure and privilege to work with before. The reason it came about was in my work, although this is not something I had originally signed up for, I ended up doing quite a lot of media work with radio, TV and newspapers as somebody who's an activist, campaigner and researcher across equalities issues. What I found was that I became very quickly, without signing up for this, the kind of default position to call, the default person to call when you wanted to talk about diversity or when you thought there was something diverse to discuss. Now, I'll give you an example of where that particularly went wrong. Earlier in 2019, I had somebody call to ask me if I'd like to come onto the radio to discuss Diwali, which was an upcoming religious festival for the Hindu and Sikh community as well in Scotland. Now, I am neither Hindu or Sikh, I am Muslim, but it was an assumption as to who I was and what information I could provide. Another time, I was asked to come in to talk about my migration journey, which, by the way, is from Portobello in Edinburgh, if anyone's interested. But it's not an experience that I have. It's migrants' rights is something that I have talked about and worked on, but it's not my lived experience. But again, it was this assumption of who I was and what box I ticked. And it made me really realize that actually, despite me sending on information about phenomenal women of colour, because I had my own spreadsheet on my laptop to be able to share with editors and reporters, very rarely were they going to the people that were needed. It's also a response to the failing of DEI, diversity, equality and inclusion initiatives in the media sector, which doesn't actually respond to women of colour. In fact, the way that they're designed and conducted was often actively excluding women of colour from engagement in media, from policy making and influencing in commentary and beyond in Scotland. So in October 2019, in a kind of general fit of rage, I got the permission of the 28 women that I was signposting already, and I started a website. So I made it public, which creates more scrutiny and transparency, both of who is on that list and who has access to influence, and creates an expectation of media to use it. Slowly, since then, it has grown, and we've opened this up to beyond those 28 women, and it currently has just over 250 women of colour and their expertise on the website. If we can go to the next slide. Thanks, Katie. So what we've achieved since then, as I've mentioned, the directory now has over 250 women of colour on it. And if you are a woman of colour based in Scotland who is interested in being part of it, please do add yourself. You can just go onto the website, click on Become an Expert. And one of the important things is I'm using expert because expert means a whole range of things. But women, and particularly women of colour, often don't describe themselves as experts. And it's really important that we see our expertise as being of value. So whether you are a teacher, a nurse, a lawyer, a social care worker, and you have expertise in those areas of your work, or you have lived experience expertise of the work that you're doing in your life as an unpaid carer, as a parent, as a campaigner and community organizer in your local community. Maybe it's about a health inequality that you've experienced that you want to share. These are expertise that matter. These are the experiences of life in Scotland that matter. So please don't hesitate from calling yourself an expert and sharing. I can assure you there's many people in media who call themselves experts who shouldn't. So you really shouldn't hold yourself back. If anything, have a little look at media, and by the end of it, you'll probably feel quite good about yourself. In the time that we have existed, we've also created in the third year, we created the Pass the Mic Opinion Writers cohort. And this was to support and enable women of colour to be able to write opinion pieces where they are often the least likely to exist in Scottish newspapers and press. And we have been doing that since this is our fourth cohort that's finished. And we usually take around 20 to 25 women in each cohort, and we partner them with editors at key newspapers. This year we worked with the Scotsman, the Herald, Press and Journal, the Courier, and the National, alongside also non-profit platforms like Bella Caledonia and Engender too, and Migrant Women Press. We do this to provide new platforms for women of colour to be visible and for women of colour's opinions to be shared. As a consequence of this, they're more likely to be engaged and asked to be on TV, asked to be giving evidence in Parliament, asked to be participating in events as speakers because their opinion and their expertise is out there in the public domain. Across this time, we have published 80 articles, and many of those women of colour have been asked to come back and do second articles, third articles, or asked to provide quotes and expertise as quotes within newspaper articles. Alongside the excellent Dr. Karen Boyle and Dr. Melody House, we have done media monitoring, which is essentially counting the women of colour that appear in a section and a timeline of media. We've done this in 2020, 2021 in the Scottish Parliament elections, and then again this year in 2024. Karen and Melody will tell you much more about that, but it's really important for us to be able to keep doing that type of research, to be able to track if the work that Pass the Mic is doing is actually making a dent and a difference, and if the campaigning work we're doing directly with media platforms is compelling them to try harder to get more women of colour onto the page, onto the screen and beyond. Next slide. So a little bit of what we'll be doing next. In 2025, the Writers Cohort will be opening for applications in February. We are hoping to do 2026 Scottish Parliament election media monitoring, and we'll be continuing to work with newspapers and broadcasters ahead of 2025 to influence and shape how they will do that work in the election in 2026. We also do a fair amount of skills building and skills sharing with media. Last year, we did a day session where you got to engage with reporters and producers at the BBC in the Glasgow studios, actually be in front of the cameras, in front of the mic and the radio studios, to be able to get a feel for what that's like and be interviewed by one of their key presenters. We're hoping to do something similar this coming year. We'll also have the annual Women of Colour gathering for Pass the Mic, which will be in June this year, We've done it the last 2 years. The first year was a pilot and it was adored, so we did it again, and it was really brilliant. This year we had Jean Johansson, who's a columnist and presenter, and Fatima Manji, who was the first hijab-wearing news anchor for Channel 4, come along and speak. And it's just a really brilliant, soul-nourishing and powerful event, and we hope to do that again this next year. So, very few newspapers and broadcasters have the internal culture or resources to do the outreach and the kind of relationship building that we're doing at Pass the Mic. What we're trying to do is create avenues to change that. We're hoping to work more directly with media to be able to do the culture change work that's needed. What we don't want to do is create access points for women of colour to be involved, but to have bad experiences in those places, which we have sometimes seen. So our work will be, in the coming year, really focused on how do they take the learning of the work that we've done so far and apply it internally to their cultures within across newspapers and broadcast. We have mainly ad hoc pieces, which are in most ad hoc opinion pieces in newspapers are not paid. So we're doing what we can to encourage newspapers to pay and reserve money for expertise from diverse voices, because at the moment it's Pass the Mic that pays for the pieces written by the women who are involved in our writers cohort. So the work we want to do is to encourage more opinion pieces to be paid for directly by newspapers and those who have the, for example, advertising revenue to be able to invest in women of colour writers. So there have been incidences whilst we have been doing this work of some tone policing of women of colour, especially when the articles are in relation to racism, Islamophobia or xenophobia in Scotland. So what we are doing in response to that is actually priming editors to understand that the purpose of Pass the Mic is to provide authenticity and for there to be a fair and respected space for women of colour's anger, if that is what is necessary in their opinion pieces. And it's on Pass the Mic and editors to do more work on that. And we also are very aware that we need to balance what is often referred to as the deficit model. So one of the pushbacks we often get from some news platforms, not all, many are super supportive, but some have told us that actually the women need more skills. Now we are happy to provide skills, but actually the skills that are needed is the open-mindedness, objectivity and relationship building, understanding, for example, anti-racist and feminist practice within newspaper cultures. So if we're building up the skills of women of colour, there needs to be a responsibility to build up the skill within the news industry, because we don't want to fall into a deficit model where we are providing skills and confidence building to women of colour only and not the skills and accountability building that is required within the news industry. That is part of our kind of core belief of Pass the Mic, and it's really important that in the coming year, from what we've learned over the last 4 years of doing this work, is to embed that better and do more accountability work across media and also representative spaces of media as well. So that's what we've learned and we'll be doing more of over the course of 2025 and 26. Yeah, so I'm going to stop there, and I'm hoping you'll have lots of questions about how Pass the Mic is formed, what we plan to do, or maybe you've got ideas for what it is that Pass the Mic can do next. We'd be really happy to hear about that. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Karen Boyle. Thanks so much.
Karen Boyle. I'm at the University of Strathclyde, and along with Melody House, who's also on this call, and a team of researchers, including Fiona Mackay and Marie McDermott, who are also both on this call. We conducted research looking at the coverage of the or looking at Scottish news over the election period, and specifically focusing on where women of colour appeared in that news. So the slide here shows you the media that we monitored. What did we actually look at? We looked at TV, newspapers, and at stories shared on X from the handles listed there. The stories we looked at were those with a Scottish angle. So we were looking at stories basically produced in Scotland, or where there was reporting that talked about events that were taking place here, or people based in Scotland and working in Scotland. And we did that because those are the stories over which the Pass the Mic partners that Talat's spoken about, the media partners that they've worked with over the years have most control. So we think this is a key point to kind of really highlight where things are working, and also, as has already been suggested, I think, where they're not. So although we've done 2 studies before, this was our largest one to date. So if we can move on to the next slide, I'll give you just some headlines of what we looked at. So we looked at nearly 8,000 news stories, not newspaper, with a Scottish angle in the 4 weeks up to the general election in July 2024. That seems like both like it was yesterday and also like it was about 10 years ago. But that's the period we looked at, and we've got the breakdown on the slide there. You can see that the largest proportion of stories came from X, but we also looked at 3,376 newspaper articles. The TV stories obviously are smaller in number because they're in small bulletins, but they're often very long stories featuring multiple people. We did some initial work just because the topics covered in these stories can often skew what our results are. So I'm going to talk to you specifically about the election stories again at the end of what we talk about. But 3 other stories we thought might skew our data that we wanted to get a bit of information on. If you remember, the election was taking place at the same time, the run up to the election at the same time as the Euros, and the men's Euros, and Scotland's men's team were in the Euros, and we expected that would skew our data, because although we only looked at news stories and commentary, we didn't look at advertising, we didn't look at sport. When sport was presented as news, as of course it was a lot in that period, we did code those stories. So as you can see, 9.3% of the stories we looked at were about the Euros, and that will have an impact on the data. The other 2 things we looked at, the first weekend of our studying, of our monitoring, was the weekend that Taylor Swift played 3 concerts in Edinburgh, and that had pretty blanket coverage across Scottish news. Because that was a story where lots and lots of people were drawn on for their personal opinion, again, we just wanted a flavour of how dominant that story was. And although that was only 3 days out of 4 weeks, you can see that it made up a fairly hefty 3.2% of all stories. We also thought there might be a distorting effect of the ongoing conflict, the genocide in Gaza, and that could have had quite a distorting effect. But actually, we found, although this is significant in itself, very, very little reporting on Gaza that had any kind of Scottish angle that talked about what it meant for communities here, or what the impact was on and with Scotland. So the other thing we did was look at every single person appearing in those stories, and we coded over 8,000 journalists or anchors. Now, that's not to say there are 8,000 individual journalists and anchors, but actually that's, people can be counted multiple times, but it's about who has prominence in those stories as well. And then we coded every person appearing in the news story, and that gave us 17,920 people in the news. So if we can move on to the next slide, what we're going to do now is I'm going to hand over to Melody, and she's going to talk you through the findings for all stories, and then I'll come back at the end to talk about the election stories specifically.
Thanks, Karen. So yeah, I have the depressing job of giving you all of the really bad statistics that we found. But to start off with our journalist sample that you can see here on the slide, men clearly dominated in our news coverage, and women of colour were really had a marginal presence in the news. If we move on to the next slide, one of the things that we wanted to look at for Pass the Mic in particular was commentary and opinion articles, because this is something that Pass the Mic, obviously, as Talat has just spoken to, really focuses on with their work. So we coded 317 newspaper and commentary stories, and of those, only 11 were written by women of colour. So this is unfortunately a bit too small for us to actually have any meaningful analysis. However, something that we did want to point out was kind of looking at those 11 stories that we coded. 6 of those were actually from recurring columnists in the Scottish Sun and the Sunday Mail, which is really an indictment on the other newspapers that didn't have recurring women of colour columnists. But of the 5 that remained, 2 of these columnists were actually in direct partnership with Pass the Mic. So one of them was the GP medical educator, Dr. Siggy Joseph, who wrote a column in Scotland on Sunday. And then also Ellie Copperlinger, who wrote a piece on the apathy of young people voting in the election for the Herald. And then a third person who actually has been part of Pass the Mic in the past also wrote a piece looking at education and how education can tackle the far right for the Sunday National. And that was by the primary teacher and lecturer Nuzhat Uthmani. And she was part of the Pass the Mic Women's group in 2021. Then the remaining 2 pieces were written by Dr. Adil Akinci Perez, who is from the University of Edinburgh, and she's actually on the Pass the Mic expert database. And then the final woman of colour columnist that we had was Myrtle Dawes, who's chief executive for the Net Zero Technology Centre. So that kind of talks about at least how we can see that Pass the Mic is making an impact here, although there is obviously still a long way to go. And if I could go to the next slide, Katie. Thanks so much. So here is when we move on to start looking at people who appeared in the news, so moving away from journalists. But again, as you can see, men continue to outnumber the women. So white men, again, dominated. They made up over 60% of all people who could be categorized. And women of color made up only just under 2%. And I've noticed here on the slide that the numbers are actually switched for women of color and women not of color. So it's not 20%, 24% women of color. That would have been amazing. It's only 1.6%. So yeah, 24% were white women that we coded. But the proportion of men of color, as you can see there, seems a bit higher, specifically if we look at what women of color looked at compared to white women. However, this is basically because of 2 men in particular, and that was Rishi Sunak and Anna Sarwar. And Karen will speak a little bit more about their overpresence in our data when she looks at the election coverage in particular. So if we kind of think about the 3 media platforms that we covered that Karen spoke about, so newspapers, television, and Twitter, or X as it's now known, the gender split was pretty equal across all of these. Television did perform better in gender, but this was only really with journalists and anchors. And when we actually look at people in the news, the proportion of men and women was the same, basically. So it's around 60% of men and in the 20s, 30% of women being represented across all of our sample. So when we're looking at people in the news, there's still a big way for newspapers to go in terms of representation. But if we can go to our next slide, some of the findings that we found there. So when we looked specifically at who was quoted and who was photographed in the news, and here we focus specifically on print media, the marginalization of women of color was even more marked. So just over 1% of all people quoted in our sample were actually women of color. And the woman of color who was quoted the most in our sample was actually the English Conservative MP and now Tory leader, Kemi Badenoch. And in fact, that actually points to one of our findings, which was that the majority of women of colour that were quoted in our sample were not themselves based in Scotland. And this is despite the fact that we actually only coded stories that had a Scottish angle. So that's a clear point for Scottish news organisations to really focus on, is bringing in Scottish women of colour voices. In our previous studies that Karen mentioned before, we found that women of colour were more likely to be seen than heard. And as you can see in this graph here, this pattern persisted in this sample. So women of colour were much more likely to be photographed than they were to be quoted in any of the news stories that we coded. And if we go to our next slide, where we looked at the function of people in the news, Expertise is the most sharply gendered category. So men made up over 70% of all of the experts that we coded, which was actually more marked than our previous study. So there's something to say there as well. So experts actually made up quite a small proportion of our stories overall, only just over 3%. But obviously, because of the focus of Pass the Mic on expertise with their database, this was something that we were interested in seeing where the women of color appeared. But depressingly, there were only 5 women of color who were used as experts in our entire sample. So there were just 2 women of color on TV that were presented as experts, and one of them was Talat, which shouldn't come as a surprise if you've listened to her introduction. We had 1 woman of color on an X story and 2 that appeared in newspaper stories. So if we move on to personal experience and popular opinion, again, this is a category which media organizations actually have the most control over who they interview for these. So this was another point that we were interested in for this study. So in this particular study, there were more people in both of these categories than in our previous study. But as Karen mentioned, this is likely because of the stories about Taylor Swift and the Euros and the election. But despite the extensive coverage of Swift's Edinburgh concerts, men still dominated in these categories. So 59% of those giving personal experience and 64.7% of those giving popular opinion were men. Women of color made up just 2.1% of those giving personal experience and 2.3% of popular opinion. However, when we looked at their proportion of different groups fulfilling these functions, it was striking that women of color were actually more likely to occupy these functions than any other group. And that's what the graph on the slide there represents. So if we move to our my last slide, I just kind of wanted to demonstrate what this looks like basically when you're looking at the news. So here is just 2 examples of a spread that you would see of the Euros coverage or the Taylor Swift coverage. So a lot of the articles and coverage of this in newspapers included images of the fans that went to either of these events. And as you can see here, just that visual representation of kind of the whiteness of both of these crowds and these fan bases. And the invisibility really of people of color in these stories. Only 8 women of color actually appeared in stories that were about the Euros, and women of color made up just 3.2% of stories about Taylor Swift. So, although the data does point to some kind of some achievement in terms of the visibility of Pass the Mic campaigners and writers. Unfortunately, the figures are still quite a sobering reminder of how far the Scottish news media has to go. But on that cheery note, I'll hand over to Karen, who will talk more about the election results.
Which is going to be even less cheery and without photographs of parties to soften it a little bit. So can we have the next slide, please? Yeah, I realise we've kind of got a bit of a spoiler in our title there that kind of tells you what it was we found. So what I'm talking about now are just the stories that were about the election, about the Westminster election. And as the headline says there, men were more dominant in election stories than in the sample as a whole, considerably more so. So the pie chart that you see there is all people who featured in election news. And you can see that white men made up 64% of all those people appearing in those stories. Men of colour, 13%. So men in total, 77% of people in stories about the election. And you can see that women of colour were 1% of people in election stories. That's a pretty sobering statistic. Now, in this sense, the relatively high proportion of men of colour can largely be accounted for, as Melody's already suggested, by two men. Anna Sarwar alone made up over 40% of all men of colour in the Scottish news stories about the election, and Rishi Sunak was close to 40%. So party leaders as a whole have a distorting effect on election coverage, and that's really well documented in existing research about elections. But the range of roles in which men of colour appear is notably narrower than the range of roles in which white men appear. So whilst the party leaders Sarwar and Sunak collectively accounted for more than 3/4 of appearances of men of colour in election coverage, white male party leaders accounted for 44.9% of all white men. So you can see there's a pretty sharp differential there, that even though there were more white men who were leaders of political parties, proportionately there's still an awful lot more roles that white men fulfill in election coverage. When we looked at who was quoted in election stories, and that's again focusing specifically on print, the marginalisation of women of colour was even more marked. So just 0.9% of all people quoted in Scottish newspapers' election coverage were women of colour. So just to put an actual number on that, which is pretty sobering, that's just 21 women of colour in 1,114 newspaper stories. Now, bear in mind that's in any role. That's not just the roles of politicians. That's also vox pops, experts, and so on. Only one of the women of colour who was quoted was actually a candidate in Scotland in the Westminster election. And the majority of the women of colour who were quoted were not based in Scotland, and that mirrors what Melody's already talked about for the sample as a whole. Now, although here too, experts were actually a very small proportion of those appearing in news stories, because their views are given particular weight, we did also drill down and look specifically at experts in election stories, and depressingly, we had only one woman of colour expert featured in stories about the election, and no prizes for guessing who that one woman of colour expert was. But given when you look at the database of experts that Pass the Mic has, it includes a number of experts in Scottish and or British politics, and that's academics, but it's also activists who are aligned with specific parties. Talat's already done the work of putting the people there, and other people have done the work in putting themselves there, but they're not being used and not being regularly called upon. Those sharing personal experience or giving personal opinions were also relatively small proportions of those appearing in election stories. Women of colour fared better there than they did as experts, but still very small numbers overall. And also they tended to be concentrated. So actually, there was just 9 women of colour giving popular opinion in election stories, but 3 of them were in just one story. So again, it just shows there's just not that diversity of coverage. You can easily engage with election coverage in Scotland about the Westminster election and not see or hear from women of colour who are based in Scotland. So we just wanted to try and give a little bit of context. How do we understand these figures? And we did that by trying to think about who represents us in a broader sense. So if we can move on to the next slide, what I want to finish by talking about is how we might understand these media figures relative to the population, but also relative to political representation. Now, it should be pretty unsurprising to say that election coverage is dominated by politicians. So more than 80% of people in the election sample were politicians. As I've already said, party leaders play a disproportionate role within that. One of the interesting things that means in a Scottish context is that very few of the politicians who appeared in Scottish newspaper coverage were actually candidates in Scottish seats. And I think that in itself is an interesting question and a potential democratic deficit that the Scottish media need to be looking at. But we also we took party leaders out of the politician sample just to see, okay, who's left and what does that look like? Now that group wasn't as male dominated, but it was still 62.8% were men. You can see though that once we take out Sarwar and Sunak, the proportion of men of colour drops from 13% to 4.3%. The proportion of women overall goes up to 34.3%, but just 2% of politicians in all stories, not leaders, just sort of ordinary politicians, were women of colour. Now, how do we understand that? Because one of the things when we've presented this work before, the kind of pushback we'll sometimes get is, well, look at the proportion of women of colour in the population, or how many of women of colour are there actually in Parliament or in Westminster. So we did a bit of digging, and what we found here, first of all, is that in relation to gender overall, our findings for Scottish media actually pretty much time with what colleagues down south found about English-based election coverage, where the argument, where the finding was that just 1 in 5 of politicians in the 5 weeks leading up to the election were women. So, you know, if we look overall at our 80% being men, we're broadly in the same space. The party leaders' domination, we've already talked about. And the other way to situate the findings then is in relation to the profile of the candidates, the leaders, the elected MPs, but also because we're talking about Scottish press, elected MSPs are important here too, because they might well be expected to be drawn on as experts in this coverage. But if I just take the figures for candidates, 69% of candidates in Scotland in 2024 were men. 80.6% of people in the election sample who were politicians, but a higher proportion of those were men. 81.5% of all candidates standing in Scottish seats who were mentioned in our study were men. So sorry, that number isn't on the slide. I was confusing myself there. But so just to be clear about that then. So of candidates in Scotland in 2014, actual candidates, 69% were men. Candidates in the Scottish media, 81.5% were men. So what we found, and only 0.3% of all candidates appearing in the media were women of colour, and that's lower than their proportion in the actual candidate base. So what we found overall then is that media coverage was even more male dominated than our parliaments or our candidate lists. And let's not kid ourselves that we're doing great in those spaces, but whatever advances have been made in those spaces are still not fully being reflected in media coverage. So we think there's still work to do, the kind of work that Pass the Mic's doing about expanding who's thought of as an expert, who's brought in to speak in those spaces, but also really making sure that journalists are not just turning to the same faces on the same issues to basically tell the same stories, and maybe tell some stories that are those that are currently being neglected. And I think that's a good point to hand back to you, Talat.
So over the course of the year, we're going to be using the data that Fiona, Melody and Karen have put together in training and presentations with editors and producers. So we've already created a briefing that went out to all media partners that have been involved or engaged in Pass the Mic over the course of the last few years. And some of them actually asked us to come back in and have a chat with them and their wider teams. We're going to be creating it into more of a workshop so that we're actually able to go into those spaces alongside organisations like EMCC or the National Union of Journalists, and we'll be reaching out to them to disseminate the information, also provide more spaces where we can do not just presenting of the data, but also do a little bit of accountability of what is it that causes this landscape to exist when it comes to women in colour and underrepresentation and misrepresentation in news, and what it is that news platforms can do. We'll also be sharing it with decision makers, including Scottish Parliament and Scottish Government, and it was recently discussed at a Scottish Parliament evidence session where we talked about the representation of women of colour in politics, and we included their representation in media. We'll be doing more of that to try and get more, to spotlight it more and to try and get more information out to as many people as possible and to get attention paid to it. A lot of hard work has gone into a very complex piece of media monitoring, and we want to be able to make the absolute maximum use of it to be able to create change. In the evidence gathering that you saw, it is noticeable that many of the women of colour that are actually in the news are from Pass the Mic directories, and specifically from the Pass the Mic writers cohort. So it is making a difference. But our work is to try and have that difference being made without the need for women of color doing the hard work of extra work of getting themselves there in the first place. So how do we create a system and an infrastructure that doesn't actually need Pass the Mic to exist to do the advocacy work, and for it to be normalized in the way in who is chosen to be expert, who is chosen to give their lived experience or personal experience within news. So at this point, I'm going to move on and introduce Assa Samaké-Roman, who is a journalist, columnist, and commentator on Scottish and French politics. Assa, I thought I could start off just by you telling me a little bit about how you got into your role, what kind of work you're involved in as a woman of colour, a too rare woman of colour journalist in Scotland, and a little bit about what the work that you do currently is.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much for having me. Good evening, everyone. So my name is Assa. I'm a columnist and a journalist. I write in the French-speaking media, so Radio France International's website. I do Le Figaro as well. I do travel stories for them. I do some editing work as well, ad hoc for organization. And I'm a weekly columnist in The National. So I have a column in the newspaper every Wednesday. I started really with The National and really in all sorts of English-speaking media, just because I decided that I should maybe stop waiting for someone to open the door and stop waiting for people to give me authorization to do what I want to do. And I guess I just started it, really. I started my blog, I started my podcast. I think one of the great things in the age of the internet and the age of social media, maybe one silver lining in the ocean of bad things with the internet and social media, is that it does give you a platform. And I decided, why shouldn't I have a platform? If nobody's giving me one, I guess I'll just create my platform and find my audience. And turns out, a few people were actually interested in what I had to say. And this is how I got noticed by the editor of the Sunday National at the time, Richard Walker, who asked me if I wanted to be a guest contributor. And for a year and a half now, I've been writing in the National every week, which was a difficult exercise for me to have my name and my face and my opinions out there every week for anyone to read, really. But this opened a lot of doors for me. So I appear quite regularly on Scotland Tonight on STV. I do more work on UK broadcast media. So LBC, for example, I contribute quite regularly to this. And I try to do as many things as possible, which is quite fun.
You mentioned there that you found it quite difficult for your face and your name to be there. Can you talk me through that? What was it that you found difficult, and how did you get over it? Because in Pass the Mic, I hear that a lot from women who say, yeah, I've got a lot of things to say. I'm not sure I want to publish those things.
Yes, absolutely. I think especially in opinion writing, you're second guessing yourself quite a lot, and this is something I try to do less and less, and I'm trying really to build myself up and build my confidence. But at the beginning, I used to compare myself a lot to who was writing and who was out there. And needless to say, there aren't a lot of people like me, my age, my ethnicity, non-English speaking person, I'm not a native speaker. So I was getting in my head quite a lot at the beginning, sending my column every 3 p.m. I really had to do, my internal pep talk, really repeat to myself that, there's no reason why I shouldn't be in this newspaper. If I'm giving this platform, if I'm told, write about whatever you like, basically, there is a good reason. I'm bringing something to the table and I need to embrace that. And I feel like it's a journey. I'm not quite sure I'm there yet, but I look at myself, for example, last year compared to who I am right now, and I feel that more and more, I just think, you know what? I'm just going to be myself 100% and bring that to the table, because nobody can be you better than you. So just do that.
Thank you. Yes, I feel like I'm on like a kind of self-help webinar where I'm getting some information. That's helpful. I want to get your take on the kind of research and the data that you've seen so far. Now, I said beforehand that we're going to talk through the research and it's going to be disappointing but not surprising. And I think for those of us who are working in this space, that is what we see. But what are your kind of initial reactions to the kind of data that we've gathered?
It's not surprising, but seeing the cold reality of numbers is a bit of a shock, especially, for example, sharing this event online on Blue Sky. I had someone out of the blue who just came out and said, like, this is not what a white man who explained to me what representation was about. I'm not quite sure I remember the comment entirely, just because I'm very quick to hit the block and, dismiss button, which I recommend to everyone to protect your peace on the internet. You don't need like random people coming to your face and explaining to you like things that you already know and have a really good sense of. But, you will have a lot of people who will say, oh, representation doesn't really matter. This is not what, like the media is about. You should just like feel represented by the people who are there, which I find very funny because, for example, if you look at every time there's even just the suggestion that a Black actor, for example, is going to embody, someone who's, I guess, been presented as white or, has a non-specified ethnicity in a book, for example. A lot of people say, oh, but this is not representative. As a white person, I don't feel represented by this person of color. And I just feel that, generally, as a society, we should have honesty as why we find it acceptable that people are so underrepresented. It is shocking that you see fewer women of color in the media than there really are in the population. This is not normal. How come we don't think these are valuable voices to have in the media? Well, how come we think that this is not like a perspective that we should have, and perspectives, plural, because there's not one woman of color. It's a diverse, very complex population. I don't claim to represent every woman of color in Scotland, certainly not even every Black woman and not every French person. It's a very diverse population. Why do you think that for people of color, we can just do with what I think is what I take from this research is this. So you will have different answers to this question. People will say, well, it's difficult to find people of color because, I have, for example, my email address is on the internet. I'm the editor of this newspaper. The email address is on the internet. Anyone can just come to me and, talk to me and pitch something to me. But if you don't really see yourself in the media, in newspapers, in those spaces that are very elitist, can you really blame people for not coming forward and getting in touch with you and, being brave enough to say, hey, I want my name and my face and my opinions in a newspaper? I think we need to have honesty about the barriers that exist, and the representation is one of the barriers. You won't solve everything by having representation. You need also to talk about, social background, the fact that the industry is very elitist. If you're a young journalist starting, you will be offered internships where you won't get paid a penny, or it won't cover, your rent and your bills, etc. So this is something that puts people away quite a lot, and there are certain demographics that will be underrepresented in journalism. So this is something that you've got to talk about and to solve as well. But it's also the general representation in the media. Who do we say, who as journalists do we ask questions to? Who do we invite in our panels? How do we make sure we don't actually need, as you said, women of color doing the heavy lifting for this to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just going to remind those who are on the call that you can use the Q&A button, and you can click on that and send in your questions, whether it's from me on what we're doing with Pass the Mic, where it started, why I thought it was a good idea to use up my weekends in that way, whether it's for Katie and on what the Equal Media and Culture Centre is doing, Melody and Karen on this particular research, or Assa on her experiences. Please do, there's brilliant women on the call, so please do make the most of your time with them. So use the Q&A button, and you can submit those at any time, and I'll ask them shortly. But Assa, I wanted to come to you with another question, and that the kind of tagline of Pass the Mic is tackling underrepresentation and also misrepresentation. And I think we don't talk about misrepresentation as much, because I think underrepresentation is perhaps a bit of a safer thing to talk about. We're used to talking about it. We talk about women in politics. We talk about it in terms of the people we see on screen in movies. as you mentioned. But actually, there's an issue around misrepresentation with women of colour, and in fact, communities of colour and migrant communities, for example, full stop. We're seeing such a surge, a continuous surge of kind of disinformation and misinformation in press, and sometimes it can be quite subtle. And I'll give you an example of this. I remember during the kind of first year of COVID, when it was articles about communities or local neighborhoods who were kind of defying local lockdown regulations, who weren't adhering to guidance. And I felt like there was a disproportionate number of women in hijabs and women in burqas that were used as the images alongside those articles, even though it wasn't those communities that were disproportionately not obeying lockdown rules. So there's also this side of misrepresentation of us in media and what that does to cohesion and division within communities. Have you experienced that? Have you seen examples of that? And what do you think can be done about it?
I think there's a massive training effort that should be done for journalists, photographers, people who, film and represent people, to really know how to represent situations and stories in an ethical way, and not in a way that is going to, kind of paint a picture of certain communities that is going to become, kind of the imagined reality for people. Because whether we like it or not, the media, it also creates that. It also it's a representation, it's a lens through which we view reality, right? And this is why we need diversity in the media, because the way I see society is probably not going to be your way, or Melody's way, or Katie's way, or anyone in the room. Is going to be, we're all going to have slightly different perspectives. But when you have an industry that is very monolithic, the problem is there's only a certain worldview, and someone it's even unconscious. The journalist who did this package you're talking about people not respecting lockdown restrictions and flouting the restrictions. Maybe they didn't even know what they were doing. It was just quite kind of natural to them to do it this way. But the problem is they should probably have a producer who either is trained or is from those communities saying, hey, wait a minute, the way you're portraying this is actually not okay. We need to rework on this. This is a really, really big issue. And, for a lot, I'm talking about media, but it's also organizations, for example, international organizations. I happen to work with a global health organization, and there's there was a training about the images that were used, talking about like outbreaks in Africa, etc. Like, be very mindful of how you show people, not to reinforce stereotypes. It's like, I don't know if it's the same expression in English, it's the snake that is biting its own tail, It's a vicious circle. And I think one way to break it, if you're having more diversity in newsrooms, that is absolutely important. So it is up to the editors, the managers, the people who own, media outlets, to really put the money where the mouth is, because this is also how you ensure that people still want to consume your media outlet. I'm not really willing to give, my attention, my time, my money to a media outlet that is going to portray parts of societies as, others or strange or not law-abiding citizens. And this is absolutely vital that newsrooms do that.
Thanks, Assa. I think it's really important. And I think, because of the kind of work I do, when I see particularly images or like the background image that's used or the example that's used, I know what's being done. It's my job to notice these things. And I think we're so normalized to it as a society that the bias comes into the newsroom and it's ignored because it is so normalized in practice. Like, there's just even the kind of inflammatory language. You just throw in a particular ethnicity as an example, or you throw in a particular community as an example, and it's not the thinking about, well, why did you choose that community? Why did you choose that image? And we're in this vicious cycle that you're talking about, where media responds to what's happening in communities and communities respond to what's happening in media. And we are just feeding a cycle of, in my view, complete hostility towards
Absolutely.
minoritized communities.
Absolutely. And in France recently, there was a massive debate about it. So unfortunately, a young woman was killed, and a man, raped her and killed her. And in every news outlet, the precision that was given that it was that he was Moroccan, I think. And in one TV show, there was one journalist who was in the panel and who said, why do we have to say that he's Moroccan? And there was such a backlash against this guy because the other journalist was saying, well, it's factual. It's a fact. He's Moroccan. And then he said, we had also this massive trial, the Gisèle Pelicot trial, this woman, one, I don't know, bravest woman on earth probably at the moment. And her husband was never mentioned, referred to as, this French white guy. So he said, why do you think in one case we have to give people this ethnicity, religion, etc., but not in another case? Because when you do that, you are telling people, well, this is a factor that you need to take into account because that might actually explain in part this person's behavior. But it's a difficult conversation to have sometimes because a lot of journalists think they're just doing their jobs. They're giving people the information that they want to have. Obviously, in a very xenophobic, tense society as we're living in, people are going to want to have this sort of information. But is it really your job as a journalist to reinforce that? I don't think so. I think your job is to work on the facts. And if you are going to give facts, give the same facts about everyone, which obviously is not happening.
Yeah, 100%. We've talked, so there's no shortage of bad news stories about what it is that we're doing and why we're responding to it. But I'm actually quite keen to know what's a really can you tell us about a really positive experience that you've had whilst doing this work, whilst being in this space, that would help perhaps encourage and inspire and motivate women of colour to feel like this is a space that we belong in? Because one of the things I'm hyper aware of is when we talk about when everything is really, really bad, and we talk about how bad the data is, it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy that women of colour will say, well, why do I want to be there then? And we're trying to make it better to get them to want to be there, to get them to want to stay in that space and engage. But there are good news stories as well. I mean, if you look at some of the editors that are partners with Pass the Mic are like go above and beyond, really support it, really are always getting in touch with us to tell us like, okay, there's this opportunity. Do you want us to promote this here? So there's good actors in a sea of perhaps not such good actors. But can you tell us about a win that you've had or something that felt good when you were in media that could be a bit of an inspiration?
Yeah, I mean, if I can reassure everyone, it's not as bad as you fear. I know, like, I like to think maybe it's because, I don't have like my face every night at 6 p.m. on the BBC. I don't have like millions and millions of people who, know me and read my stuff. But still out there, still on the internet, it's shared on social media, it's a national newspaper. So I do have a little bit of profile. And there is, there's always going to be people who are going to be a bit hostile, on Twitter, which I'm not really visiting anymore. Obviously, in the comment sections, which you should never, ever, ever read. Leave it. It doesn't exist. It's not where the interesting thing is happening. Obviously, you're going to have a little bit of hostility, but the vast majority of people are just going to read your stuff and think, that was interesting, and just get on with their lives. And sometimes you even get really, really nice comments. And even just today, I wrote a column. It was about childcare and how, it's mind-blowing to me that childcare is treated like a luxury in the UK when really it is a necessity. And the editor of The National, Laura Webster, who is absolutely fantastic, she forwarded me some emails from people who said, hey, actually, recognize what Assa is saying, I see her, I understand her, which is always really, really, really nice. And, the perspective that you're going to put out there is going to resonate with so many people. You are not alone. You're not isolated. You're not unrepresentative. Some people who say that as a woman of color writing in national media, you're not representative of the majority. But yeah, I actually am. On a lot of aspects, I am. And, recognize that as well. There's many aspects in which you are a minority, where, most people will think, oh, she's very, very different. But on a lot of things, actually, what you have to say will resonate with a lot, like a huge chunk of, for me, this is what I find really gratifying about this job. And working with a newspaper like The National is really, really great just because of the freedom that they give me. They don't try to tell me, oh, actually, you shouldn't write it in this way because, it's going to be difficult for people. One example, for example, right, in the middle of Black Lives Matter in 2020, I wrote an opinion piece about, when everyone was putting black squares on Instagram, which kind of got on my nerves because I thought it was very performative. And I just found it extremely irritating. So I wrote a slightly angry column, and all the editor had to say at the time was still Richard Walker. He just said it's an amazing column. It's going to be a very difficult read for a lot of our readers, but they need this. And you will find editors. I don't know if it's the majority. I've not talked to all the editors in Scotland, but you will find editors, you will find media outlets that will be interested in having a very authentic, a really honest point of view, because I think this is what, takes the conversation forward.
Yeah, amazing. I always tell anyone on the writers cohort that nothing good happens in the comments section, so you can just ignore that. I do, although it's advice that I need to take myself, but if it helps anyone, you'll have like the first 5 or 6 comments that are maybe related to your article, and then you'll come back like 6 hours later and it says like 135 comments, and you get the fear. But actually, it's just 2, usually men, having a go at each other. And it's ended up being about something like potholes or football. And it's got 100% nothing to do with what was in your article, but they just don't like each other. And they've done the same thing on the bottom of lots and lots of other articles as well. So if it helps, not only is it not worth reading because there might be, abusive behavior there, also because most of the time it doesn't make any sense. So all the more reason not to spend too much time on it. We've had some questions in, and this is, I'll send this, it's for anybody any of us to respond to. But what are some of the common excuses given by media producers for not including women of colour? And I'm happy to respond to a little bit of this, but the excuses that I get more often than not is we didn't know that there were women of colour who had expertise in a particular thing, even though there's 250 of them on the Pass the Mic website. And the second thing is, and this is where it's not necessarily about media, but it is about political parties or it's about organizations. Media will talk to whoever it is that the organization has put forward as the spokesperson. So this is where charities in the third sector need to start, charities, third sector, public sector, political parties need to start thinking about who gets to be the spokesperson, who gets to have that role, because actually media can't come back and say, we don't want your spokesperson, we want somebody else in the organization. They will have to take the person you put forward. So that's why it's more than just media. It's a kind of Scotland-wide issue. Do others want to come in? Assa, have you had any responses about kind of excuses as to why you don't have more women of colour in news?
Generally, the excuse is that, oh, if they don't come to me, how am I going to know about them? I have like only 24 hours in my day. I can't be out there looking for women of color. Or maybe there are no women of colors, who are competent or talented enough to be writing here or there. Or, this is always something that you hear. And it's the same in politics, want there more women in politics. Maybe they don't want to. Maybe they, the people are not really interrogating the barriers. It's all about individual responsibility when you have systemic racism and sexism, which is it is a bit depressing when you hear that from people. I feel like we've been talking about the same subject for years now, and they should have got the memo, but clearly not.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and if anything, it's just become a bit passive aggressive, to be perfectly honest. But yeah, we have been talking about this for a while. We've got another question that is, what policies can be implemented, or kind of just what actions can be done to promote the representation of women of colour in media? So what do we want to see media do? And, Karen, I wonder if I can come to you and the kind of research that you've done, and you've been doing different types of research on kind of gender inequality across media. What kind of things do you think exist within the power of media or the journalism space to be able to create change?
I think the point you were just making about spokespeople is a really good one, because actually I think what it reminds us is that the media can't and won't change without other change happening. I think what our research has consistently pointed to is that the media isn't changing even at the pace that, say, political parties are. So, it's not that the media are let off the hook by that. But I do think it's important that we don't see the media as, if you like, uniquely bad in this space, that actually there's work that as you were saying, political parties or third sector organisations or universities need to be doing, to think about, how do we enable people to be spokespeople, to speak for us, to speak of their expertise. So I think not seeing the media as kind of uniquely bad is probably quite important, quite an important part of that. And part of that then is also about, it's tricky. So one of the excuses I hear a lot at the moment, Talat, to go back to the earlier question, is actually about, well, the media sector is crumbling. Okay. So actually there is no resource. And there is no trade. So I think that's where the kind of partnership approach that you're taking with Pass the Mic is really important, because I think it's different if we are looking at organisations. A lot of the media organisations in Scotland are not replete with the hundreds of staff on permanent contracts. So I think these kind of partnership working, and as we know, when that's the case, equality, diversity and inclusion initiatives are the first thing to go, and we need to embed them so they're not. But that also means looking at partnerships where possible, and looking at the responsibilities of those of us that feed into the media, as well as of the media to represent us.
Ken, you've also done like a fair amount of work with kind of journalism educators and like the next generation of journalists, which, we all kind of have this hope that, younger means more progressive, although I'm not going to go into the details of the likelihood of Gen Z voting for reform. That's a different presentation and one that I will cry at. But the kind of next generation, do you think that there is more that can be done in that space, or do you see progress in that space actually?
So I think all these spaces raise different kinds of spaces raise different kind of questions in terms of who's got access. So access is an issue, but it's also then an issue of amplification. So I think there was an awful lot of talk at one stage about, the democratizing potential of social media, and, we were all able to be content creators now, and To some extent, that's true, but the costs of that are not equally borne. And I don't mean financial costs there. I mean the kind of, online backlash and abuse that you guys have talked about a little bit already. And therefore, that's again where I think, it's also then about amplification. So even when we look at spaces that might seem to be working outside of like the logics of the press or broadcast, actually their content very often relates to what's going on. So it's setting the agenda. It's what's the agenda that's being set, and what stories can we be telling differently. That wasn't really an answer that was optimistic, but I'm sure I've got some optimism. I'm just not quite sure where it is. Give me a minute, I'll try and find it. Come up with a good news story.
That's fine. That's fine. I think I've certainly seen a lot of interest and enthusiasm for Pass the Mic from journalism educators. So the ones that are having the conversations, I've been, invited, and Melody has done it too, where she's gone along and talk about this work and Pass the Mic to journalism students. And I think getting that planted in someone's head at that stage of their journey is brilliant. But the issue, of course, is that when you're looking out at the audience of who is becoming a journalism student, it's not a very representative sample, and women of color are pretty much missing from that space. There's only a very small handful of them.
And I think that's where we also need to expand what we're thinking about in relation to journalism, because the work we've been doing so far is very news oriented, but actually there's a lot to do around, say, lifestyle, but also sport, because actually, if you like, conventional news journalism is a shrinking part of that space.
Yeah, absolutely. Melody, a question for you. What's involved in media monitoring, and what are the types of skills used in gathering that kind of information?
Wow.
A lot of time basically is the main thing, but it's actually very easy to do if you have that time aside, which I think is why it's a really great resource to have, because it's really easy to gather that data and to and as Talat has kind of shown to us, it's valuable to have that information as well, because I think it's very difficult to contradict or to argue with just raw data and numbers. But basically, media monitoring is about counting. So you would decide on what kind of organizations or what kind of news that you want to cover. So for us, we looked specifically at news media. So we did newspapers and television, and we did X. So looking at the news organizations' Twitter or X feeds. And what we did is we followed a kind of a schedule, which is actually available on the Pass the Mic website. So if anyone wants to replicate what we did, you're able to kind of follow how we did it. And that kind of sets out exactly how many stories we coded for each different organization, how we counted those stories, what we would include, what we would exclude, for example, and all of that information is on the website. And then it's just literally about going into an Excel document and counting all of those numbers. So as you kind of saw from the data, we look at information about the story. So what's the topic of the story? Where does it appear? Whether there's images or anything as part of the story. And then we also code the people that appear within the story from journalists, and then also people being quoted or used or mentioned in the news story. So it's really, media monitoring is basically just counting all of that information and putting it into spreadsheets, and then getting all of the summaries and data from that. So it's it's quite simple in in how you do it, but the kind of difficulty there is that it takes a lot of time, because you have to go through all of that news coverage and news stories. And really the value in it is the more stories and the more information that you can get. So that's why this particular round of coding, we did a much larger data sets. We covered 4 weeks, whereas in previous ones we've only done 1 week at a time. But as we said, that takes a long time. So the coding schedule is available on the Pass Mic website. So if anyone wants to do their own story, their own media monitoring exercise, then you can do that and add to our data. And if you follow our schedule, you can then compare to what we've got as well. Because the value here is really just building up this data and continuing it on for years, so that we can have this kind of database that we can compare back to, which is why, as Talat says, we're hoping to get funding to do it in the next Scottish elections as well. But yeah, so that's basically how to do it. Happy to answer any more questions about it, but it is quite boring, I understand.
I don't think it's boring at all. I think you undersell how much work it is. And just to say, there's also the kind of global media monitoring project, where there's, vast amounts of data which are about, gender representation. But actually, this is the largest study of its kind that is about women of colour and Scottish media. There is no other study like this that exists. So having that intersectional analysis that is both about race and gender, it doesn't happen in many places, which is why this matters, and why Pass the Mic wanted to actually spend time and source money to be able to do this, and wants to continue doing it, because this isn't actually the kind of normal type of media monitoring you get, certainly in other places. That's hugely helpful. Mevish was kind of a point here, but rather than a comment. But I think she said, I think there is a depressing link between the lack of media representation, stereotyping, and then the race riots in the summer. It's actually powerful to angle that as leverage in terms of accountability for how media deals with representation. And I think that's a point well made. Although I think there's two parts of that. One is about representation. The other is about disinformation, which is a different part of it, but an important part nonetheless. Disinformation is usually used to target a particular set of communities, women of color being one of those communities, but it is about how much disinformation spreads, how that's targeted. And I think what diversity in the newsroom does, I think if you have diverse backgrounds in the newsroom, they may be able to detect the consequences of that disinformation or question some of that, the accuracy of some of the information that's coming through a bit better. But there is an issue across the board, particularly on social media or on platforms that are not kind of traditional news, about how disinformation spreads and just how harmful that can be. I think we've got another question that's just come in. Are there any open recruitment programs available to students? This topic is very attractive and interesting and worth studying. So I don't know if Karen and Melody, if you've got any kind of student placement opportunities coming up, or if you know of places that people could get information about this research and engage in this as students.
Sorry, my unmute button wasn't working there. So, well, we don't have plans to do, well, obviously we do have plans to do stuff around the Scottish election, but that's a little bit of a way away. But the next iteration of the Global Media Monitoring Project is next year, and my colleague Fiona, who's on the call, will be leading the Scottish contingent of that. That is run by volunteers, so just keep an eye out for, be in touch with us if that's something you want to get the training on and participate in. You could drop me an email and I'll make sure that gets passed on.
Thank you. That's great. And if you are a woman of colour who's interested in becoming an opinion writer, Pass the Mic applications for their for the writing cohort will be out in February, and we'll probably have another 5 media partners that we'll be working with. And it's a really great group to be part of. It's just, we're going out for drinks tomorrow, so I mean it's just a really good group to be part of. Do apply for that too. And I think there's a question, Assa, I might come to you for this. When you're choosing what to write about, I think that's something that's actually quite a big deal. It's quite kind of be overwhelming. Here's what's your life story, what's going on in the world, and what do you want to write about? But what if it's something that you think is really important, but not in the news and not normally given news space, which I think when it comes to women of colour, the experiences that they have, whether it's about health inequalities, it could be about racism, it could be about sexism, it could be about migration, whatever it might be, often the way in which a lot of the women on Pass the Mic want to write about it is not the type of thing that's in the news, but the kind of thing that they wish was in the news. So how do you convince the editor that that's something that's worthy of putting in if it's not reactionary to news? Certainly from Pass the Mic's perspective, one of the things that I always say is that if it's a compelling read, it's a compelling read full stop. It doesn't need to be a compelling read that responds to something that's in the news or responds in the way news would. A lot of the time, a good opinion article is one that is a compelling read full stop. So it's something that your perspective can bring in, your authenticity can bring in. And I think if you think it's something that should be discussed in the news, that in itself is enough of an argument to be able to make to editors. And one of the things that I think is really compelling is to explain to editors that actually there's a chance that you bring a new audience into their space that is perhaps not reading their paper or their platform. And by talking about this, they will have potential new readership and reach new audiences. And I think that's usually a pretty compelling case on that. Assa, do you want to come in? I don't know if it's working now. I don't want to.
I think it's working better. I can still hear and see you.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
that's better.
Amazing. I was typing my answer, but I was thinking, a good opinion piece doesn't have to be strictly linked to something that's in the news to be deserving of a space in a news outlet, like the news agenda, it's a decision-making process as well. You can't put everything in the news. It's a matter of choice, from the editor and the journalist. And sometimes there are choices that they don't make, but you can make a choice. And I think for me, it's about explaining in a very clear and compelling way why you want to write about. It might be a conversation that you had with someone. It might be a personal experience. It might be anything that just kind of, made you kind of obsessed about this particular thing, and you need to write about it and make people, aware of it. Very simple thing. For example, my piece today about childcare, I had the idea to write about it because I received my latest childcare bill on Monday. And it was when the funded hours kicked in. So, I wanted to do a little dance in my kitchen because I was like, oh my gosh, I can breathe now. And basically, that was the starting point of my reflection about, why don't we value this more? Why do you have to wait until your child is over 3 years old to maybe be considered of, worthy of help with childcare? And maybe you can think about your career a little bit more. Maybe you can go back to the workplace. All of this in a country where you have so many columnists and journalists like throwing their hands in the air thinking, why don't women make more children? And they, and thinking about having people more economically active. And we don't talk about this. Maybe this is because this is something that is going to overwhelmingly help women, and we don't really value what is going to help women. So just to give you a little example of what, kind of triggers my thought process. And generally, it's either something, that happened to me or someone I know, someone close enough. And basically, for several days, I just can't stop thinking about it. So this is what I write about.
Yeah, that's usually how it works, right? The angrier you get and the more it's become obsessive, the better the article. I love it.
Absolutely.
I feel like I know I've got something good when I've gotten up at 1 a.m. still angry and I've written it in the early hours of the morning. That's when I know it's going to be a good one. Thanks so much, Assa. Thank you to everybody who's on the panel. We've come to the end of our time. A huge thank you to Katie at the Equal Media and Culture Centre based in Gender for putting this together, doing the promo and coordinating all of us, which is not an easy task. So huge thanks to Katie, huge thanks to Melody and Karen, who have been consistent supporters, and Fiona, who's on the call, of Pass the Mic, and have produced this research time and time again, and they do it in a meticulous, detailed and really accessible way, and I really appreciate them and their engagement. And Assa, as always, it's always a pleasure to talk to you and to use you as a source of inspiration for other women of colour in Scotland, and hopefully getting more of them into new spaces. So thank you. Please continue to be involved. If you know women of colour that should be part of Pass the Mic, send it on to them.